Mainly, this webinar series is looking at exploring how precision fermentation can impact the circular bioeconomy. So this is sort of a simplified look at the circular bioeconomy and how we've been looking at it at the Levenick Center. And really what it is you have sort of your main bioeconomy, which is a more linear pathway that you have crop systems that generate feedstocks that then will be put through biomanufacturing process to produce goods that'll go to the marketplace. And each of these different steps within this process ultimately has certain waste products or residues. And the idea is to create a circular bioeconomy is that we're then trying to recover as many of those waste streams as possible in order to reuse in these various steps. And then kind of overarching this whole entire system, we have human environment systems, which is really about human behavior and policy and how that impacts the different stages within the circular bioeconomy. And so what we're really focused on for this webinar is looking at a specific biomanufacturing process, namely precision fermentation, and trying to understand then how it might impact sort of the upstream and downstream parts of the circular bioeconomy. So this webinar series is organized in multiple different seminars. And you can see back in March, we had our first seminar, which was just Introduction to Precision Fermentation. That's up online right now if you'd like to go back and watch that one. And then our upcoming seminars after today are looking at sort of the various other stages of the bioeconomy. And our seminar today, though, is focused on biomanufacturing and scale up. So today, our two speakers are first going to be Brian Jacobson, who's from the University of Illinois. He's the Associate Director of Strategic Operations for IBRL and the Food Science and Human Nutrition Pilot Processing Plant, also Program Manager of Infrastructure for IFAB. And then we have John Ellersick, who is the President and Principal Consultant for Next Rung Technology, who's going to be talking to us about the more industry side of this. So if you have any questions about the series, feel free to contact the Levenick Center. That's Levenick Center at ic.illinois.edu. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started with a presentation from Brian. So I will stop sharing. And then, Brian, you should be able to share.
Great. Is that kept coming over through okay, Ken?
Yes.
Perfect. So thanks much for the introduction, and thanks, John, for being here as well. IBRL teams learned a lot from you and your team, so it's great to give a presentation here together. I'm going to share a little bit about what IBRL does and what we have learned in our time here working with startup companies. And then we're going to hand it to John, who's got a number of case studies to walk through from their experience in pilot and then all the way through some of the higher scales of commercialization. So just real quick to place you, the University of Illinois campus has two pilot plant facilities today, Integrated Bioprocessing Research Laboratory. That facility is focused on the scale up of broad any different type of ag feedstock into food ingredients, different types of industrial chemicals, cosmetics, fuels, any really bio-based type of material. Our food science and human nutrition pilot plant sits at the same scale, working with similar feedstocks, but directly into human food. We can do some different sensory. We can do different studies there for clinical or animal side. We can make samples that are able to be consumed because we are a FDA registered facility on that side of our business. So we can make samples that are able to be sold in small stores or sensory evaluations and things of that nature. Just a tiny bit of history then too, and kind of what our business model looks like. We grand opened in October of 2018. This slide says we've worked with about 150 companies. It's actually about 160 as an update here after this last week. So we've worked with a lot of companies in that time period. The reason for that is we work under a self-supporting business model. And we have a cost reimbursable fee structure. So companies can come in, utilize our space for a day, a week, a month, a year. We've got a lot of companies that come in here on a week-by-week basis to do work as they move through their scale-up process. We have clients that have been with us for 4+ years now. And then we've got some others that have been able to, move quickly and have moved on to market. We aren't interested in IP in the IBRL facility, so any IP you bring stays with you when you're working at IBRL. Most of our capacity here goes up to about the 1,500 liter or kilogram scale. We can support process development, scale up. We can do the regulatory work that I mentioned. We have really, really good equipment vendor relationships. We're a great center for lots of activities. So companies are doing their scale up. Students are learning how to utilize this equipment and be on, future decision makers in industry. And then we host a lot of industry short courses that allows us to have a great spot for vendors to want to place their equipment for people to see and use those. So a little bit of the background. We're going to speak today, though, mostly about precision fermentation as one tool for biomanufacturing. So I have this slide up here to talk about some of the major steps that happen in this, or the major components of a precision fermentation process. Picking your feedstock is really important. Dr. Singh in the last webinar talked about that in pretty good detail. We do a lot of prep work here at IBRL to help get feedstock situated well to go into these processes. The fermentation process itself, the microbe, eating that feedstock and turning it into a product of some type or growing biomass is done. There's downstream purification where you further purify that. And then there's the final formulation into whatever your final product is. And this is why IBRL is really interesting, is we're the first scale typically for companies where they have enough of it to make a burger or have a 5-gallon bucket of final chemical or enough to make a bottle or run an engine or make a shirt, whatever that may be. The one thing we don't do here is strain engineering. So that top piece there that feeds into the fermentation, that's a bit of a different science. The University of Illinois does tremendous work in this. There's a lot of other places that do work in strain engineering as well. That's outside of IBRL scope. But there are a lot of people that are doing this work in strain engineering, which is why we have so many companies looking to utilize our facility. This is just a really quick chart here, shows how biology has gotten cheaper more quickly than Moore's Law. Moore's Law is what dictates number of transistors and the cost of them on a chip. Through the digital age, biology is exceeding that in terms of how quickly it is going down in cost to bring that forward. So lots of ideas, but without execution, those ideas aren't worth very much. So the scale up is a really important topic. When we are talking about that here in our area, and I think John's examples tend to follow this too, we're generally in the specialty chemicals, food, or chemical precursor market. This technology is also used heavily in pharmaceuticals. We don't do that as much here. Main reason for that, it's just a little bit different a lot different regulatory market, different scale, different type of feedstocks are used there, and very different cleanliness required to be in that market. So we tend to be in those three at the side, and there's some really nice markets associated with that, which is why we spend some time. So scale up at its simplest, and the reason that IBRL was funded is there's tech readiness level scale, kind of a 1 to 9 that you see there. Governments and universities tend to fund the left-hand side. Private sector tends to fund the right. There's probably a good discussion over whether that model and whether these numbers still make sense in today's environment. But generally, there's a gap between the two, and it's an expensive gap to fill with equipment for companies to move through that scale-up process. So IBRL is the bridge of helping go from your benchtop, early feasibility stages over to a point where industry starts to become interested in the technologies and in a readiness to scale. To do that, you're using a lot of equipment like you see on the right-hand side. So that fermenter dead and center in the top, that's a 500 liter, kind of hidden behind it. There's a 1,500 liter equipment. On the bottom there, you see two different scales of centrifuges that are there. And so those kind of are at the hundred and thousands of liters type scale. So the equipment's big enough. It's still very industrial, but not so big that you can't kind of wrap your arms around it. And it's a good spot to learn and figure out what you're going to be moving forward on. So this is the space that we play in this scale up ecosystem for fermentation. What that generally looks like for a company moving through, they start off at the lab, milliliter scale in flasks. They move to some glass bioreactors, typically smaller than 10 liters. They move to pilot plant, 50 to 1,000, maybe 2,000 liters in scale for pilot plant. You're working with actual stainless steel reactors like you saw in the picture before. You then move to demonstration scale. That tends to be in the 25 to 100,000 liter. This is where definitions get hard, depending on what your market is. Demonstration might be 5,000 liters, it might be 200,000 liters. It depends on what you're making, but generally about there. And then you have your industrial reactors. And again, in the pharma side, 5,000 liters might be industrial. But if you're making a fuel, you're over at the 500,000 liter and kind of all over. But generally, these tend to follow this scale. Through this time, it's became pretty well known that we need more of this scale. There are lots of reactors at the laboratory bench all over. There's not enough pilot and demonstration scale, or at least not well fit for companies to be successful. IBRL sent a lot of companies overseas, and that's been a real challenge for them and for getting this industry moving forward. So we've been working to improve that. A little bit about how much time companies spend at each scale. So if you pull up the chem engineering textbook, we are an academic institution, so got to reference the textbook. Rule of thumb is that you should never do more than a 10-to-1 scale up, and you should spend about 1,000 hours at each scale. If you're running a 2 to 4 day fermentation, that means 10 to 20 runs at each scale before you can move to the next one. So if you're at the 100 milliliter, then you go to a liter, then you go to 10 liter, then 100 liter, then 1,000 liter, 10,000, then 100,000. It's not quite that prescriptive, but it does generally follow about that pattern. In our experience, though, it's not necessarily due to the fermentation scale up that requires that. I had a fermentation here, had a career before he worked here, scaling 100 liters to 100,000 liter fermenters very successfully. That was well understood, but having the downstream process work well and be scalable was really challenging. Having investors willing to see you make those types of jumps and deal with the risk, very challenging. And also having, and I talked about TRLs, but commercial readiness levels. So do you actually have clients ready to move up to those scales that quickly? Also falls into place. So we've seen that 10-to-1 scale up hold pretty true over time. We've also formed a bit of a narrative here over where companies should spend their time and where they should invest their money. We've worked with a lot of companies that have done the laboratory work in their own lab on their own equipment that they've bought, and they built expertise around it. We've seen really good success with that. You build a little bit of, you build some knowledge on what your fermentation looks like, how it should run to help you navigate these next steps that you go through. That's worked out really, really well for companies. Outsourcing that does tend to put you at a disadvantage unless you just happen to be outsourcing that thing, but you have a lot of expertise within your company otherwise. The next step for the pilot scales, I'm going to sound biased saying this, but I do think that outsourcing for pilot makes a lot of sense. It is a different type of facility, a different type of knowledge that's required to run at pilot scale. There might be some argument that you should spend some money in that pilot plant to get your exact equipment, to get more of a continuous or integrated line rather than just piecing together different unit operations. But having a facility that has all the steam, the power, the chilled water, all those things to work well together is a real advantage. And instead of spending millions of dollars to build these pilot plants, you can rent them for six-figure types of money typically. And they're often something that you don't need that long. So it's a good spot to rent. Moving on to the demonstration and industrial scales, commercial scales, we really think partnerships are important there, contract manufacturing or situations. There are companies that go out and build their own sites. That's fantastic. Would love that when that happens. But in today's market where it's so capital restricted, those partnerships tend to be real wins. There's also some big companies out there that have a lot of internal experience that are really, really helpful for this too. So we've seen good success on that. So moving forward a little bit into these, in the lab, there is a lot to learn. You're figuring out, what organism you're going to use for your process. You're starting to make some assumptions about how you might purify it. You're figuring out what your titer is going to be. You can get a really high level TEA or techno-economic analysis to figure out if you should move forward. It's always an important step, is not how, but should you move forward at this stage with your process. The goal here is really to get into the funding that you need to do the further development work to see if this will actually scale. Supply chain is often limited here. Most of the time you're working on a lab supply catalogs. You're not working with realistic chemicals or materials that you're going to use later on. But there are some good things you can get figured out about your media formulation and that here at this laboratory scale. As you move to the pilot plant, you get up into those hundreds or thousands of liters scale. This is the first time that you really can buy or work with a scalable DSP unit operation. So going back to those pictures, those centrifuges, those don't look anything like what's on your benchtop. Filtration units don't look much like what's on your benchtop. This is the first time you can get something, then you can talk to a vendor and say, it works like this at 500 liters. I need something that does 50,000 liters, and they'd be pretty confident they can do that type of scale. Supply chain, we've seen here really, really undeveloped supply chains, getting away from the Fisher Scientific and the Sigma Aldrich catalogs and getting into some of those supply chain relationships that don't require ACS reagent grade chemicals for these fermentations is great for your TEA, but also just great for cash flow because the costs are very, very different here. We've got a great supply chain. We've developed that. We've got a really good network with IFAB to help. But what the companies are learning is that fermentations run a lot different in a stainless steel reactor that has some back pressure, that has steam used for sterilization rather than just filtration or autoclaving everything. INOC volumes become important for the first time. So what percentage are you moving from your smaller tanks to your bigger tank each time? If you're only doing a 1% INOC, you need a liter to go into 10, you need 10 to go into 100, you need 100 to go into 1,000. That gets pretty hard. If you can get those inoculation volumes up through some optimization, that's really helpful. Strain stability might come into play here because it's the first time it's lived so long in a larger fermenter. You start to fight pH controls as you get into larger reactors that are a little harder to sing to in the lab when they're not behaving. You've got a little bit more limited of system to work in. Also, hiring experienced staff becomes a challenge for companies here too. Working on a stainless steel fermenter with all those utilities is a lot different than working in the lab. You do get a lot more data, and I'm sure folks like John are a lot more excited to get pilot scale data than lab scale data when they're doing TEA services and others that we work with. So much more realistic data, and that's because you typically are running scalable processes here. You also, though, are getting product. So I mentioned the kilogram scale. You're typically getting enough product to test things, work with that, go through regulatory certifications. If it's a food product, you're generally recognized as safe or GRAS process completed with FDA. And then, of course, more funding. Again, good place to stop and say, not how do we, but should we move forward? You've got a lot more decisions. You've spent a considerable amount of money to get to this step. But before you go spend a lot more money, a good look into how the business is doing, how the process is doing. This is a great step to really figure that out. I'll go through this really quickly because I know John's going to cover a little bit more of this, but as you get to the demo and production side, obviously supply chain becomes extremely critical. You're no longer buying 50-pound bags of materials. You're buying drums, totes, rail cars, semi quantities of these materials. The other thing that's really important is at the pilot scale, a lot of times you're working with unit operations, not a fully integrated system where you're bringing mass balances into question. You're figuring out what you're doing with your wastewater and other, and heat energy from those processes, what you do with waste solvents if you're using them, what you're doing with your byproducts. This is the step where all of that gets factored in. This is the step where when Ken talks about the Levenick Center and the circular notion of what happens also becomes really, really important. It's hard to do that at the pilot plant. These demo scale plants, you really have to have that figured out. It becomes a lot harder to figure out and make changes if you have issues. So something that I might be able to change in my pilot plant for 1,000 or 10,000, tens of thousands of dollars become hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to make changes at these larger scale plants. So having that data before you get here is really, really important. And then you're also not running a lab project anymore. The fact that you maybe started this company with a master's or a PhD degree starts to become maybe as much of a hindrance as it does a benefit. You're starting to think more about operations. You're starting to think, about how you actually run this in 3 shifts and get all of those industry manufacturing type optimizations running here. You stop worrying about a tenth of a gram or even a gram or even 100 gram or even a kilogram in scales in some of these. You're working on much more of a manufacturing ready and tolerant process. The benefit, though, is this is the step that you hopefully start to see some profitability and have product that goes to market. So to summarize these a little bit, what we've learned in the time since we've been operational is industrial biotech scale up is not what a lot of VCs would like it to be. It is not at a simple, easy, scalable software process where you go out there and you get 10 users, and then you get 100 users, and then 1,000 users, and you let it all be broken, and you just kind of keep moving forward and get better as you go. There's a pretty prescriptive process you want to follow. It's technically challenging. You need a lot of experience from different fields. Most of the time, if you're doing it, it's pretty new and novel. It requires a lot of capital, resources, network, and often tightly held industry knowledge to be successful. So we really think ecosystems and partnerships are critical to get there. Some of the biggest things we talk about, though, the bullet points at the bottom, DSP development is always lacking. It always is behind the fermentation process, always needs more help. The 10-to-1 scale-up factor follows, but it follows because of the other factors I talked about, not just how big the next fermenter is that you're working in. We do think there's a good opportunity for some fermenter equipment offering in this market to be disrupted. It's really hard to find vendors that'll sell you a 10-liter, 100-liter, 1,000-liter, 10,000-liter, all work on the same software, have some of the same opportunities there. So I think there's that. And then lab skills and procedures don't translate terribly well. That takes some time to go back and forth, get the right people. Supply chain vendor relationships are needed to start early. And then startups should find some partners in getting into these pilot plants. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John and let him utilize the rest of the time that we have here. I'll stop sharing.
All right. Let me share. Thank you, Brian. That was one of the best introductions to scaling up bioprocessing I've ever seen. So, as Brian mentioned, we actually cross paths a lot in the scale-up ecosystem. I'm John Ellersick. I'm president of Rung Technology. We focus on scaling emerging process technologies. And we have a series of talks we've been giving called Navigating Scale. It's May now, spring, and we're all thinking about the summer and looking good for the summer. And you need to do the same thing when you're heading out there to scale up your bioprocess. So we're calling this presentation the Scale Up Six Pack to get us all in shape to scale. One of the things we like to do when talking about any of the elements of scaling up is move beyond specific lessons learned and trying to create data sets of information. So we brought together 6 case studies. That's where the name Six Pack came from. They're generally successful programs. They're a bit anonymized. And we'll talk about the features of these in groups of 2: smaller scale next generation materials and products, a medium scale precision fermentation to proteins, and larger scale, again, precision fermentation to sort of bioplastics and commodity chemicals. And then we'll run through how each of these programs scaled across the vectors of, how did they go from pilot to commercial scale? What were their infrastructure and capital requirements and approaches, their techno-economic constraints and cost drivers, and partnerships. And then talk about sort of the outcomes, challenges, cool things they accomplished, black swans that may have come into play, and what would have or what will make the difference to companies as they scale. And then we're going to wrap it all up as sort of a data set, lessons learned, similar to how we wrapped up that introductory session. So next, Rung Technology, we focus on scaling sustainable technology solutions. We work across a set of process technologies, but about 50% of what we do is industrial bio, next generation foods. And we do this set of things, I would say, all the things you need to do to scale. At our heart, we design and build, we're engineers, we design and build plants and projects. We do also do a lot of consulting and modeling, have deep process expertise to turn benchtop concepts into real industrial equipment, help with strategy, and help developing small, medium, and large projects and delivering them for our customers. So the case studies we look at, we group them in groups of 2. The small and medium size set, again, next generation materials, medium and large. So we mapped out the path to commercial scale each of these guys took for what commercial scale meant for them. And sort of an interesting observation along the lines of what Brian said is they really did all follow this lab bench pilot, um, commercial one, commercial two pathway at all scales. Um, the medium-sized ones did all their initial piloting at third-party sites. And for these six built their own pilots plants themselves at different points in time or combined CMOs with pilot plants. So people do take different pathways. And one of the things we observe as people are scaling their technologies is that scale up really is a bunch of make versus buy decisions. There's a lot of third-party outreach you run into as part of execution. Um, and you need to build this skill set, which is an organizational skill set along the way. For infrastructure and capital, how people built their facilities along the way, we definitely saw a mix of, you'll see the word partnership show up over and over again, but some of these smaller ones managed to be self-built with their own equity or achieve major government funding. Some of the larger ones got government funding. And the medium-sized ones were the ones that actually were sort of in the precision fermentation space, uh, ca- mindful of capital and did a lot of work with partners at partner sites and at CMOs. Um, if you look at what drove economics across the board, it really comes around to are you making a high value product or not? It's nice to be making a high value product. There's a general rule in biomanufacturing of make something worth money. It gives you the ability to enter low volume, high value markets first, and then scale out to the more commodity cases. Um, but for the most part, the economics that drove choices were high project CapEx when you get to medium or large scales, and the overall economics of biomanufacturing, which is unlikely to support products that are below single or $2 per kilogram type pricing. Um, all of them just simply had the operating cost impacts of running fermentation processes, and those operating costs tended to be higher the more complex or energy intensive the downstream process is. If you think about it, membrane-based processes that can isolate your product quickly are actually much more operating cost and energy favorable than processes that include things like distillation, evaporation, or solvent extraction. Once again, all of these folks employed partnerships with investors, with acquirers, and in some cases across the ecosystem. If you think strain developers here, technology developers there, partnerships were key in every one of these facilities. Um, Black swans are a thing that happen. I've been worked for five startups myself before starting Next Rung Technology, and we ran into our own sets of black swans. So we viewed this as a category, and it's sort of unexpected changes you can try and plan for in risk assessment, but in point of fact, you may run into them. Um, Many of these folks ran into COVID, which was not, of course, an expected event. It was planned for some type of event like this, but really a bit unexpected. The energy crash impacted a lot of the renewables of the first generation. And then many folks experienced inconsistent federal funding. They benefited from federal funding, but in some cases it was also rescinded. And that, if you think about it, is actually something that you can manage as a known risk factor. Where does your capital stack come from? Um, One of the great prompts and questions for this is what would have made a difference for each of these folks? Um, so for the smaller scale folks who had more innovative processes, I think there's a role there for more generic scaling up platforms. As Brian mentioned, people need all these utilities that are not core to their technology. Um, but for folks who have a little less than a generic process, it's hard to find a scale platform. So they do often think about building their own pilot. In the larger precision fermentation cases, that 25 to 100 meter cube, the 100 to 300 meter cube are known gaps in capacity at this point in time, particularly in the United States. Um, and in the platform chemicals side of things, one thing that would have made a difference is any sort of green premium. You'll largely get this advice, and we would support it as we need to make differentiated, better products, and green premiums, low carbon sustainability has not been proven to be valued consistently. So most folks won't support that in a business case. And then larger scale fermentation capacity with complex DSPs is generally not available. This leads the larger case studies we had to build themselves. So that's a story of sort of three prototypical types of scale-up programs, small, medium, and large. Um, and we thought we'd look across this data set now for commonalities of instances, occurrences, and differences. So one of the things I think those commonalities, they all basically follow this scale-up picture from lab, bench, pilot, demo, small CMO to larger production, as Brian had laid it out. These steps are needed. They prove markets, they prove physical things. But I will say many folks who did not use pilot plants initially might have gone back later to build them, which is something interesting that we've seen. It doesn't mean they didn't take the right path, but as they became a mature company, they were working on future projects. Um, from the sort of how their infrastructure was built, people still at the small scale funded out of their own equity stacks quite a bit. They use CMOs about half the time. And then really nice mechanism is the partner sites. We saw two of these here out of six. Well, at the end, we'll really emphasize the partner sites are maybe underutilized at this point in time, but a great way to scale. And government funding was only involved in about a third of these cases. Um, as we noted, some elements of this were self-funded in all cases. About half had partner funding, 33% government funding. So what informed their choices consistently? Um, commodity products always face very tough economics where there's strong profit margins. Scaling just simply was easier or higher value products. High project CapEx was across the spectrum, but as it can be expected, and the larger ones tended to have more high project CapEx issues. Market traction challenges is really something to be discussed. What you are proving as you get larger in demo and commercial scale goes well beyond technical issues. And really, I think market traction is probably one of the major causes of failure of startup companies and a real argument for using CMO or third-party resources. Until you prove consistently that you have a market, it may not be time yet to build your own capital infrastructure. And 100% all the way along the way, there are technical learnings at scale that were experienced, whether they're planned or not. It's simply inherent to scale up. So, as we mentioned, operating costs are always a cost driver. Raw materials are probably half the time a cost driver. And all of these programs, another benefit of going into larger and larger production is they manage to drive down cost over time. Um, we already talked a bit about partnerships, but partnerships can be really a nice lift for you, the same way that CMOs can be. Science and technology companies have a core set of skills based around discovery, and the skills around execution are different. Um, Operating steam, water, wastewater labs, and office buildings is often a set of activities that are already going on at many large multinational sites, and similarly as CMO. For the price of operation there, they take these on for you and they manage your need to have those type of people on your staff and team. Again, we're a fan of partners, sites and co-location. It can reduce capital cost by 50% or more. and exploiting further ecosystem partnerships. Uh, one last rundown challenge is product traction, technical learnings, process optimization, optimization of economics. All of these happen to everybody as they scale, and this is why sometimes this is called tough tech or hard tech. This is capital-intensive technology scale up. In particular, these problems can accrue to the downstream process. Um, and we sort of split out product adaptation, which is a key point of challenge for many of these organizations across cost factors and non-cost factors. So you can have both simply a not acceptable or an accepted substitution, or you can have one that's simply not accepted due to cost. And then the larger scale-up programs also experience large demo cycles in demonstration scale cycles in the length of years. And if you think of the definition of a demonstration plant, it's actually a plant that does not make money. Once you have a plant that's profitable, you're in commercial scale. So finally, cool things that were achieved. These were success stories for the most part. So they achieved product development and acceptance. Um, Only one of these examples so far was built commercial plant two. And if you think about that, while the industrial biomanufacturing is a mature and older business, there are very few programs yet that have built plant number two. Half of these are really producing steady production at this point in time. Um, Most of them involve some very innovative elements to them, which I think they should be given credit for cool things achieved. All of them, the programs were critical for future supply chain de-risking. And on product learnings, all of them had product learnings, and we managed to come up with actually more than 100% of product learnings. These were all true first-of-a-kind projects. Uh, Again, looping back to black swans, we really would sort of suggest thinking about risk management. A true black swan is very hard to do risk management for, and we would say that risk management is great at finding conventional risks of commercialization. Black swans may still happen to you. So what would have made a difference for these companies, successful or not? Um, Platform for non-generic upstreams actually would have helped. I think my count is off here. Probably one to two of these companies where their upstream process was non-generic. Although, like I guess the assessment is here is we're not sure that would have existed. Platforms for non-generic downstream would have been helpful, I think, in the largest scales. And by non-generic downstream, I mean complex downstream processes. Successful partnering and co-location approach, I think, would have benefited all the large projects, as well as larger fermentation capacity. And again, although low carbon or sustainability being valued would have helped the largest of all these platforms, we put that advice in there on don't count on that green premium. So to wrap up our thinking on this set of six projects that scaled commercially in the biomanufacturing space, while they're all successful, they face a lot of common challenges. So first of all, difficult piloting decisions. I've been in this seat. It's hard to decide, do you go to a third party? Do you develop your own pilot plant? At the end of the day, what we've seen is if you have a pipeline of products or an innovative front end that doesn't match existing pilots, a dedicated pilot is often developed at some point in time. And if you noticed, two of those companies did it after they had achieved commercial scale. For more generic processes, third-party pilot is both feasible, can preserve capital, and can be the quickest way to first runs. The challenges can be if you have to get in line for run space, you don't have complete command over it. And if pilot or demonstration runs extend beyond the initial plan, which happens often, the cost should at the very least be planned for. As Brian said, sample materials and market development are key piloting elements well beyond technical learnings. And as noted, many people who don't have pilot capabilities when they first start, they do build them later. we've observed in the industry in sort of other presentations you'll see in the series. One is called Scaling Healthy. The long-term survivors in this industry displayed a lot of capital discipline in deploying at larger manufacturing sites. So actually, the folks who spent time at third-party sites had a greater survival and success rate than those who deployed and built quickly. So rapidly understanding project opportunities, having good techno-economics is key. In this industry, it's called the front-end loading process. And while it's great to screen lots of projects, doing the wrong project can be enterprising, threatening. So really measure twice or more before building. Um, Despite all this, physical plants are critical infrastructure for scale-up. Markets must be developed and served over time to confirm economic viability. This is not a place that an AI study can prove physically what consumers will buy. Technical learnings during that 10x type scale-up have meaningful physical components to them, meaningful different behaviors as you move up in scale, especially with the presence of solids. So we know that's also can be best designs, but still needs proof at scale. And then good operating teams drive down costs over time. Okay. And this is actually a very good place for AI, machine learning support. They can do the optimization in an integrated manner, just as great operating teams do. We are really big proponents of risk management. It can be simple at first and progressively become more deep and deeper in evaluations. You can anticipate black swan events as much as possible, but also plan for non-black swan known types of things that can go wrong. So partnership and mature technology readiness approaches really correlate with success. Take advantage of the other folks who are knowledgeable out there, use third-party resources for deployment, and know and understand the difference between your business case and maybe your year two or year three operations and where you are on the first day of running a plant. And understand those both is key to scale. So those are our thoughts on scaling up. These are some pictures of folks moving from lab to pilot to demo to commercial. We have some other resources that you can find on our website from scaling, including our Baker's Dozen series. We have a Next Run Navigator program to help people navigate support. We do a lot of TEAs and LCAs, and sort of our pitch there would be that we are folks who design, build, and operate plants, which is really what these models are all about. And with that, those were our thoughts we wanted to share with you today and move to the Q&A time.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian and John, for sharing your expertise and some of your lessons learned. I think we have about time for maybe one or two questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to either chime in or put it in the chat. Any takers? Anyone have any questions? If not, I mean, if in the future, if you think of something, I'm sure you can feel free to contact Brian and John with any questions you may have about what they talked about. Um, so if there is none, we'll close out. So thank you all for joining. This webinar is recorded, so it will be put up online, so you can view it again there. And then the next webinar is going to be on June 23rd, and that's going to be focused on redefining the marketplace and looking at how precision fermentation could change some of our future products in the marketplace. So again, thank you to Brian and John, and we'll see you all at the next webinar. Thank you.